I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you news from the NATO summit. We hear an eyewitness account of the Russian strike on the Kyiv maternity clinic. We ask an expert how they identify Russian missiles, and we discuss the attempts to Trump-proof NATO.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 11th of July, 2 years and 143 days since the full-scale invasion began. I'm joined in London by our Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls and Senior Foreign Correspondent Roland Oliphant. From Washington, D.C., we hear from our US Editor Tony Diver, and our guest is Senior Researcher at Bellingcat, Jake Godin. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
So Russian attacks across Ukraine in the last 24 hours has killed at least 5, injured nearly 20. The Air Force reported the downing of 6 Shahed drones overnight over Mykolaiv Oblast in the south, and Khmelnytsky, Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, and the Oblast in the west. Now, Chernihiv and Sumy Oblast in the north also under attack, but no casualties reported from there. Ukraine's also alleged to have been behind another drone attack inside Russia's Belgorod region. Vyacheslav Gladkov, Russia's regional governor there, saying this morning that 1 person's killed and 3 wounded after an overnight attack. But inside Ukraine on the ground is what I want to sort of briefly pause on here. Russian forces said to have captured another village in the Donetsk region. This comes from Deep State UA, a Ukrainian non-governmental organisation using open source intelligence. They map out Russian and Ukrainian military activity. They're based in Kyiv. They say the enemy, that's Russia, has occupied Yevhenivka and advanced near Yurivka. Those are both about 20 km northwest of Donetsk city, right in the middle of the Donbass. Now, it is a very fluid front line. The Ukrainian military yesterday denied reports that Russian forces had captured the village of Yasnobrobivka. That's about halfway between those first 2 villages. That idea of a very violent front line but contained in a small geographic depth, i.e. not much advancing on either side but a lot of activity, that was taken up by a point in today's update from the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War. They say Ukrainian forces are now conducting limited and localised counterattacks at the tactical level. So, all those things, limited, localised, tactical level, means very, very, very small forces, basically. They say this emphasises the current state of grinding positional warfare along the front line is not an indefinitely stable one. So ISW cite the arrival of Western-provided munitions and aid on the front lines and say that has allowed Ukrainian forces to stabilise critical areas of the front and go on the offensive in some other areas. For example, what we've been seeing around northern Kharkiv Oblast, around Vovchansk and that area. They also say around Kreminna, that's in the Donetsk-Luhansk Oblast border areas, Ukraine's been able to mount very limited counterattacks. So what they say is Ukrainian forces are not yet conducting counterattacks at the scale necessary to seize the battlefield initiative, but that these tactical counterattacks are increasing the costs imposed on Russian forces, and that their tactics of slow grinding advance is just not returning to them ground for an acceptable cost to Ukraine. But I thought it was an interesting point, sort of showing that maybe with these weapons arriving, they are able to get some very, very, very low level of manoeuvre. Now, next one, looking outside, mainly kit-wise here. So Joe Biden said that he's speaking at the NATO summit, more of which from Tony in a bit. But he said that Denmark and the Netherlands have begun sending US-made F-16 jets to Ukraine. His comments were backed up by Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State, who said that F-16 transfer will concentrate Putin's mind on the fact that he will not outlast Ukraine, he will not outlast us. Mr. Blinken said those jets will be flying in the skies of Ukraine this summer to make sure that Ukraine can continue to effectively defend itself against Russian aggression. Elsewhere, Kyiv Independent's reporting that Sweden is saying that it is up for providing Gripen fighter jets after the F-16 program is completed. There will be, it's dependent upon further steps from Kyiv. This comes from Swedish Foreign Minister Tobias Billström, speaking to Voice of America. Next one, Poland is saying it must prepare its soldiers for full-scale conflict. This comes from the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, General Kukula. He said that Poland must find a balance between army training and border security. They've already committed to boosting the number of their troops on the border with Russia and Belarus from 6,000 to 8,000 over the next couple of months. But General Kukula said, today we need to prepare our forces for full-scale conflict, not an asymmetric type conflict. In May, you may remember, Poland announced details of what they called the East Shield. This is a major $2.5 billion program to build more physical security at the border with Belarus and Russia. Now, another one from the Kyiv Indy. The first donation of 18 Ukrainian-made Bodana artillery pieces financed by Denmark should be there in the coming months. They're citing Danish Defence Minister Roland speaking yesterday. So this is part of the scheme to get Ukrainian defence industry going again. Basically, Denmark's going to provide the money. Ukraine is going to build it. They've got more capacity to build defence, munitions and equipment inside the country than the Ukrainian Treasury has to buy it. So basically, there's spare capacity here, and the push was for the international partners to buy this stuff, although to never see it. Buy it, build it in Ukraine, and it stays in Ukraine. It just speeds the whole process up. So Denmark was the first country to do such a deal with Ukraine. The $60 billion from US that was held up for months, that is going to include, said to include 1.6 billion of Ukrainian weapon purchases along the same way here. I know Tony's going to dive into the outcome from NATO, but a couple of bits popped up as I was looking at it. So in the communique, NATO say that Russia bears sole responsibility for its war of aggression against Ukraine. We will never recognise Russia's illegal annexations of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. They announced a pledge of long-term security assistance to Ukraine. They said they intend to provide a baseline of 40 billion euros in the next year. And, this is the quote, and to provide sustainable levels of security assistance for Ukraine to prevail. So, 40 billion, good. No mention of funding in later years, not so good. NATO also said that it's going to station a representative in Kyiv as part of the bridge to membership. This phrase again, the bridge to membership. It's like do with a few more details about this bridge. I thought it was interesting. This use of language, never is a 100% word. So that is pretty strong language. Never recognise illegal annexations of territory, including Crimea. NATO also talked about the shared values with Ukraine, said Ukraine is vital for the security and stability of the Euro-Atlantic area, and said Ukraine's fight for independence directly contributes to Euro-Atlantic security. So all of that seems a bit out of kilter, for my money, with the lack of a long-term funding pledge, no details about this bridge to membership, and I just wonder if we're going to hear anything soon from Mark Rutte, the new Secretary-General, or any other national leader. But Tony will have more thoughts on that. And just one final one for me, David. Washington and Berlin have said in a joint statement yesterday that they would begin deploying long-range conventional missiles to Germany in 2026 to demonstrate their commitment to NATO and European security. Now, obviously, Sergei Rybakov, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, said the deployment was an escalatory move aimed at intimidating Russia. He said, without nerves, without emotions, we will develop a military response, first of all, to this new game. Then, a little bit later, so in the last few hours, Anatoly Antonov, the Russian ambassador to the US, has said that Washington risks setting off an uncontrollable escalation with its plan to put these long-range missiles in. In a post on Telegram, he said the US had taken a dangerous militarist path and added that Washington has yet again displayed its insatiable need to show its own military superiority. Well, like the drones, we've now got Schrodinger's missiles. US deploys conventional missiles to Germany. That is obviously escalatory and a dangerous path. Russia deploys nuclear missiles to Belarus. That, apparently, David, is just what friends do.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for all of that. We will be joined by our US editor, Tony Diver, in a few minutes. I know he's just giving an interview. He's doing the media rounds. He's giving an interview right now to our sister podcast, The Daily Tea. So let's go to Roland Oliphant. Roland, away from NATO, is there anything diplomatically you'd like to pick up for us before discussing your article on Trump-proofing NATO?
Yeah, hello. It's all rather, NATO's dominating everything, so everything's more or less connected to it one way or another. But I just kind of picking up from what Dom was saying about Anatoly Antonov's talks about uncontrollable escalation, this warning that the US has taken a dangerous militaristic path by saying it's going to post missiles in Germany. I mean, this is part of consistent messaging coming out of Moscow this morning. So we also had Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, saying Russia is planning response measures to contain the, quote, very serious threat from NATO. Basically, he said that NATO is now fully involved in the conflict with Ukraine. Preston, what he's talking about, he was asked again about this thing that the Russians have mentioned before, this revisiting, this reviewing or adjusting of their nuclear use doctrine. He said that discussions around adjustment of Russian nuclear doctrine in response to NATO's activities are ongoing. But he adds that nuclear deterrence is not the only kind of deterrent, but Moscow will, quote again, will have to take thoughtful, coordinated, effective, responsive deterrent measures. So very much it's a repeated line that we hear out of Moscow quite often, and we know that the Russians were never going to be pleased with what came out of NATO, but that's a fairly direct response to the kind of stuff we've got going on in Washington. There's another little thing out of Beijing, which is also, don't want to get too far into the NATO stuff, and Tony's going to cover it, but China has accused NATO of sowing chaos or sowing chaos in Europe and told them not to sow that chaos in Asia. This is after basically NATO, the final communique is going to basically accuse China of being an enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. The term is decisive enabler. Chinese response, this is Lin Jian, a foreign ministry spokesman, said, NATO hyping up China's responsibility on the Ukraine issue is unreasonable and has sinister motives. So a lot of tension there. Elsewhere, there was another thing, just going back to Peskov and what he was talking about. Peskov was also asked, well, what about potential peace talks with Kyiv? He repeated the Russian line of we're always ready for talks, but there isn't any substance yet, and we need to know what we're going to talk about. Now, he was responding to a Bloomberg story that came out yesterday, which said, very interestingly, the Ukrainians are seeking to convene a second peace conference. We had this first peace conference in Switzerland a month or so ago, but Russia wasn't there, and a number of leading middle-ranking powers, people like Saudi Arabia, Brazil, some others, didn't sign the final communique. Basically, it ended with it looking like Ukraine's efforts to reach out to what we might call the global south hadn't really broken through. So the reporting in Bloomberg, citing anonymous sources they say are familiar with the discussion, so Kyiv is very keen to convene a second meeting to achieve a peace settlement, and that the timing is meant to be before, they want to do this before the US elections in November. There was some reporting that this might be in Saudi Arabia. It was a Russian journalist who put that Saudi Arabia question to Peskov, which provoked him to say, there's no concrete plans that he's aware of. But I think this is a very interesting development if it's true, because as we know, no matter what the bullish united front that's being put up in Washington at the moment, November is hanging over everybody. And if you can get to speak to people, kind of off the record or speaking anonymously, people are frankly worried about the prospect of Donald Trump becoming president again. So the suggestion that Kyiv wants to get some kind of peace settlement underway before November, a very, very interesting development. And I'll note that President Zelensky, in his speech in Washington yesterday, said, he seemed to make a reference to this, we must react firmly. We must and can organise the second peace summit this year based on the peace formula, even more powerful and truly decisive. We need that support from the US. And one last thing, I beg your forgiveness. This is a little bit indulgent, really, because I used to work there. The Moscow Times, the long-standing English-language Russian newspaper based in Moscow, which has been operating since the very early 90s, has been declared an undesirable organisation. You can read the report on the MT's website itself. Russia's Prosecutor General Office has labelled the Moscow Times undesirable with a designation that bans Russians from working with or having links with the organisation, with criminal prosecution for violations. The prosecutor's office said the work of the outlet is aimed at discrediting the decisions of the leadership of the Russian Federation in both foreign and domestic policy. Dirk Sauer, that's the Dutch founder of the Moscow Times, said on Twitter, of course, we will continue our work as usual, independent journalism. That's a crime in Putin's Russia. I suspect the Moscow Times will continue to endure. It's been around for a very, very long time. I certainly enjoyed working there when I did. It was a great training ground for an awful lot of journalists. Just something to mark, I think, in the ongoing Russian crackdown. And I will, in the words of Dom, take a pause now.
Well, thank you very much, Dom and Roland. Tony Diver, thank you so much for joining us. We've mentioned the NATO summit that you're attending at the moment, but can you talk us through the atmosphere there? What have you been seeing, and what do you think are the biggest stories our listeners should be aware about?
Hi, David. Thanks. Yeah, there are quite a lot of stories going on. I mean, these summits are always massive. They happen only once a year where we get all of these world leaders together talking about this stuff. So a lot of it gets saved up, and there's intense diplomatic negotiation that goes on behind the scenes in the lead up to them. So what we've seen so far is some new commitments on Ukraine. We saw a lot of discussion yesterday about the use of missiles and how far they can be fired into Russian territory, which I'm sure you've covered already. That's a major debate among allies. The UK, for instance, supplies the Storm Shadow missile to Ukrainian troops, and there's some discussion about whether or not that should be used to hit Russian targets inside Russia. And then secondary questions within that. And if they are to be used, what sorts of targets? Should they be only used against an imminent Russian attacking force, or could they also be used against strategic and infrastructural targets? So there's been a lot of discussion of that yesterday, and that's one of the major stories. We've also seen some interesting movement on China. It's been a major priority of the US for some months now to put international diplomatic pressure on China to stop supplying Russia with some of these multi-use parts, and they're things like microelectronics and machine tools, and basically the components that you would use if you were building weapons, but not weapons themselves. And China denies that it supplies these kind of materials to Russia, says that it adheres to strict international sanctions on these kinds of components, but the US says that China is freely supplying Russia with lots of technology, which is then using to build weapons, which in the opinion of the American diplomats is tantamount to supplying the weapons themselves. And what we saw yesterday was a major news statement from these NATO countries calling on China to stop doing that. That was immediately met with some anger from the Chinese government, who said that NATO was being deliberately provocative and claiming again that they were neutral in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and that they had no involvement. So that's been the other major story. And then, of course, in the background to this, we also have lots of speculation and commentary on Joe Biden himself, on his health, whether or not he's up to the job, whether or not in a press conference later today he's likely to commit any more gaffes. The sort of gaffes which a lot of pressure has been generated from in previous public appearances, not least that head-to-head debate against Donald Trump that we saw a couple of weeks ago, which has led to yesterday George Clooney coming out and saying that he should now stand down and allow a younger person to be the Democrat nominee. So there's a lot of domestic politics going on here as well, and a lot of people here, especially the American media, will be seeing this entire summit through that lens. But that's not to say that there isn't also some very significant international stuff going on, and also the appearance of Keir Starmer, our new Prime Minister, for his first international summit, and for many of these world leaders, the first time that I've had an opportunity to meet him.
Tony, thank you so much for that rundown. Earlier, Roland Oliphant mentioned that really with lots of the diplomatic news, especially the news coming out of NATO, that the shadow of Trump is looming large over all of it, really, considering the American presidential election coming up in November. Is that what it feels like for you on the ground? Is there much discussion of the former president and potentially the future one?
Yes, there is. I mean, there's an attempt to Trump-proof the NATO alliance, which Roland's already talked about, and an attempt to stop any future Trump presidency undoing a lot of the work that's going on here. I actually had a chat with a senior Trump ally earlier this week. I spoke to Elbridge Colby, who was a senior official in the Pentagon under the first Trump administration and is tipped to get a job if there was to be a second Trump administration. His main point was that the debate on Ukraine really needs to be, in his opinion, about Europe supporting Europe. And there is a kind of the argument behind the resistance to supporting Ukraine from the Americans is that European countries really need to be footing the bill for the war in Ukraine. We need to see more support from the UK and Germany and some of these other kind of defense manufacturing powerhouses in Europe so that the US can spend more time focusing on China. So I think there is a lot of concern about that, and not least because of the kind of domestic pressure that Biden's under that I just mentioned, and the current state of the presidential polls, which suggest that Joe Biden is going to lose this election. There is a lot of thinking, about what commitments can be made now, what multi-year commitments can be made, which could tie the hands of a future Trump presidency. But then again, we know that the Trump people behind the scenes have got their own plans about what they want to be doing, and they will not be happy to have their hands tied by NATO or by the current administration.
Obviously, Zelensky's been to many of these conferences, these events. How have you appraised his meetings with world leaders? Do we think he feels like he's getting what he wants? And also, Zelensky and Starmer, does it look like their relationship has got off to a good start?
Yeah, well, I think there was a lot of nervousness about Zelensky at this summit because of what happened last year at Vilnius. I was in Lithuania last year at the previous NATO summit, in which Zelensky turned up, kicked off about the kind of commitments that NATO countries were giving to Ukraine, said that they weren't going far enough on the question of membership, and basically caused a bit of a diplomatic embarrassment for all of these countries which had gathered to try and be seen to be doing a lot for Ukraine, to actually have the president then say that their commitments hadn't gone far enough. So behind the scenes, there's been a lot of worry about what Zelensky's position might be in these talks, and it seems that they've managed to pull it off. That's for a few things. That's because there were some new commitments made to Ukraine on weapons at the recent G7 summit. So that's taken the edge off of some of Zelensky's frustration. And because there has been some movement on that question that I just mentioned on Ukraine using long-range weapons inside Russian territory. So Zelensky does seem fairly pleased. We haven't actually seen the full communique from this summit yet, which is that would be released later today. And that basically sets out all of the new policy of these NATO countries. So we'll get some reaction from Zelensky in a press conference later and see what he really thinks. But at the moment, it seems that he's relatively pleased with the steps that have been taken, which is a bit of a diplomatic coup for these countries because there hasn't been any major movement on the question of membership, which is the one that Zelensky is most concerned about. In terms of his meeting with Keir Starmer yesterday, we did see a very friendly meeting. It wasn't the first meeting between a new Labour minister and him, because John Healey went to Ukraine straight away, almost as soon as the election had been won in the UK, and they had a discussion in Odessa. But yeah, we saw a pretty genial meeting between Keir Starmer and Zelensky yesterday. And Labour's position, of course, is that there's to be no change in the UK support for Ukraine under this government, and that Labour and the Tories, all the way through that election campaign, were on exactly the same page about what the UK needs to be doing. So it's no surprise that we saw Zelensky be just as enthusiastic about Keir Starmer as he was about Rishi Sunak.
Thank you, Tony. Well, we've heard our US editor there, Tony Diver, speak about the NATO summit. Roland, you've been writing about Trump-proofing NATO. Can you talk us through your article and what you found?
Hello again. Thanks for joining us, Tony. It was really good to hear your views from the ground there. So I wrote this thing about Trump-proofing. So Trump-proofing, what is Trump-proofing? Trump-proofing is the idea that, look, we know Donald Trump's views on NATO. We know Donald Trump's views on the Ukraine war. The fear is that he will somehow curtail, block, reduce, sabotage, pick the word you want, the American contribution to the Ukrainian war effort, which is an absolutely crucial one. It is not the be-all and end-all. The Europeans and others supply, about half, maybe more than half in dollars terms now. But the American contribution is critical there. So the idea was, and this was floated, Jens Stoltenberg did not use the term Trump-proofing, but he did come up with a plan which other people put that label on some time ago. And the major single policy around this is taking the thing called the we've often called the Ramstein process, or I think it was called the Ukraine Contact Group, or something. That was an American-led, American-convened things where allies got together and said, "Oh, we can give you this, we can give you that," and we gather that. The main thing that has happened and was meant to be greenlit at the summit was basically, officially a parallel version of that, run by NATO, run by the alliance, rather than the United States. Basically, the idea being you lock in that aid to some degree, you make it less dependent on the initiative of the current government in Washington. Unvarnished terms, it's about reducing the reliance on the contact group so that if you do get a more isolationist, a Trump presidency, that he will not necessarily be able to, or have the freedom of maneuver to really throw a spanner in the works of NATO support for Ukraine, or the West support for Ukraine in general. But there's problems with it. I mean, the main thing is that even this thing is going to be dependent on America. So there's this new NATO command being set up, but it is going to be headquartered in Germany at a US military base, right? For example. The other thing is, the Americans do not provide all of the aid to Ukraine. I was on the if I can name check another podcast, I was on Independent Thinking, Chatham House's weekly podcast with Kurt Volker, who was George W. Bush's, I think, ambassador to NATO. And then he was saying, look, no, the Europeans in dollar terms contribute an awful lot more. But the point is, like, take weapons, right? The Americans are the only ones who can really build and provide, the rockets that Patriot missile launchers fire, the rockets that HIMARS systems fire, all kinds of other things like that. And the other thing is that, so you've got this question of money, you've got the question of being able to provide certain systems and the quantity of systems, but there's also something America does in NATO which no one else does, and that is it's the indisputable leader because of its economic clout, its logistical clout, its industrial clout, its diplomatic clout. It can set the direction. It can decide basically which way we're going, chaps. No one else in the alliance has that kind of indisputed status as a dominant power. You take America out, you'd be looking at, Britain, France, Germany, but they're all pretty much peers. And none of them have that huge capacity that allows NATO, allows all the other parts of the alliance to kind of operate together, the huge network of bases, the logistics, that all these things that would enable NATO minus the United States, even if they can collectively match American spending dollar to dollar, they do not have that same kind of capacity to deliver. And so one of the debates that has been going on, if you speak to people who kind of live and breathe European security and North Atlantic security and what have you, they've been thinking about this for months, for over a year, really. People have been saying, what is going to happen if you end up with a second Trump presidency? How is NATO going to survive with a very isolationist United States, with the United States perhaps going through a wave of isolationism unseen since the 1930s? And I'm afraid one of the answers, I spoke to Ed Arnold at RUSI, who specializes in this thing. He was over in Washington as well. At the same time, saying, look, you would have a NATO that would have to operate very differently. You would have regional pockets of groups, one group looking after the southern flank, one the eastern flank. But the current NATO doctrine of 360-degree defense in all areas, all sectors, geographic and what have you, that can't really be delivered without American involvement. So if you end up talking about, okay, are we Trump-proofing, or are we proofing this against a wave of American isolationism that may see America in general moving away from the alliance, then you're talking about serious questions about how the alliance is going to operate in future. And the other point to make here is that, yes, Donald Trump says what he says about Ukraine. He says what he says about Europe. He's made very clear he wants the Europeans to shoulder more responsibility. Yes, people are quite scared of what might happen in Ukraine if he just tried to pull the plug on aid in order to pressure the Ukrainians into talks, and people are genuinely afraid of what he'd do that. Again, this is not just a Trump thing. Whether or not Donald Trump wins the election, there is a consensus in Washington that sees China as the big challenge that the United States has to face up to and put resources into challenging in the near term, which does mean Europeans shouldering more responsibility for their own defence and for NATO in general. That's the basic outline of the piece. Those are conversations I've been having I think I first wrote thing about this about 6 months ago, about, what happens with a retreat of America, if it is really going to retreat. But it's a very, very live question, and it's still not clear to me whether European governments have really come up with a plan. I know people are talking about it, or whether there is actually a plan for dealing with this.
So, Roland, can I just ask you a question? I think that was absolutely fascinating. I'm really interested in all these kind of structural changes that they're making. But I am also interested in kind of the damage that Trump could do to the alliance purely through things that he says on the stage. And it strikes me that while you can try and Trump-proof the kind of institution itself, if Trump goes out there and says that he wouldn't honour an Article 5 declaration, or that more generally he just is not as interested in defending other NATO states as America always has been, that could kind of do immeasurable damage to the alliance. just from a speech that he made on the campaign trail or something that he said on the stage as president. I wonder if anyone that you've spoken to had any thoughts about what the alliance can do about that, the kind of impression of NATO as this impregnable Western structure, which starts to look a lot more fragile once you don't have someone who's totally committed to it in the White House.
And yeah, I think that's a major issue, because NATO's always been, if you go back right to the very, very beginning of NATO, when it was, set up, largely a kind of British initiative, and Bevin persuading the Americans that they should remain interested in European security. It was a bit of a bluff, really. It didn't really have that many. I think it had about 12 divisions in Europe to, Russia had about, 100, 200, 300, within marching distance of Berlin. But it's always been about this intention, about this deterrent, about it being made very clear that Article 5, Three Musketeerish kind of vow, one for all and all for one, is going to be followed through on. And that's why people are so obsessed with the rhetoric. The moment you start saying, well, actually, maybe I wouldn't actually enforce Article 5, the moment you start doing that, then that creates, in the mind of this is the theory anyway, in the mind of your adversaries, people who are not very happy with NATO existing, who have designs on member countries, start thinking, well, if you're not really going to stand up to it, why don't I try this? Why don't I try that? Why don't I, astroturf some protests in Narva in Estonia, and then have some little green men show up and then see how you think about whether you actually want to go to war over this. And so on. So yes, it's a real worry. People are concerned about that kind of rhetoric. What can be done about it? I'm afraid if you have the United States clearly becoming isolationist in that way, I'm not sure there is a great deal more that can be done about it, except for European members, the other members of the alliance, trying to visibly take up the slack. And that includes, of course, rather major investments in defence spending and visible kind of commitments to their own defence, to kind of make it clear that there is a credible kind of deterrent. But look, again, going back to the very, very beginning of NATO, the first Secretary General of NATO, Lord, I forget his name, it was Lord Hastings of ISMA. Anyway, he has a very, very memorable quote saying, look, the point of NATO is to keep the Russians out of Europe, the Americans in Europe, and the Germans down. No one's quite so worried about keeping the Germans down anymore, but it's still very much the same thing. The Europeans, including Britain, need to keep the Americans in Europe. They need to persuade them to stay there. The Americans have always had this kind of, really, do we really want to sign up to this and so on? There's always been that lingering debate in Washington, and, keeping the Russians out of Europe, that remains the central task. So that I think remains absolutely central to all of those diplomats will be doing in Washington, trying to find a way to persuade the Americans, to persuade Donald Trump, if he is the next president, that he has to stay in Europe.
That's really interesting. Also interesting that was always been the priority of NATO, to keep America interested in Europe. It seems that at this summit, and more generally, as you say, that we're also looking at the US trying to get NATO countries to be more interested in China. And I wonder if perhaps, in future summits, we might see a bit more of that as a priority pushed by the US.
I think that's very likely. I mean, I think was it in, I forget the date, one of the recent years we have lived through, Tony, maybe 2019 or something, suddenly China started to appear and mentioned in NATO communiques. And now in this particular summit, the concern about China is really crystallizing, and it's really being articulated in a much clearer way. I think there's already a sense that you can see the direction of travel. You can see that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization can no longer simply remain a North Atlantic kind of thing, because its principal leading member, the United States, is very, very concerned about the Pacific. And yes, the Americans are going to require Europe to look much more to their own defense, because they're going to be thinking about the Pacific and about Pacific security and about holding back munitions that might otherwise have headed to Ukraine just because something might happen in Taiwan. And part of the quid pro quo of that, I'm sure, would be having the Europeans take, maybe not playing a major defensive role in the Pacific. I know we have these two aircraft carriers. I'm not sure how much more Britain, for example, or Germany and France could lend physically in the Pacific, but to see this as part of, another part of the alliance's mission, if you see what I mean, and to have that aligned, I think that's very much the direction of travel here.
Thank you, Dom, Roland and Tony. On Monday this week, Russia unleashed a deadly barrage of strikes across Ukraine. In Kyiv, missiles rained down on healthcare facilities, including a children's hospital and a maternity clinic. Yesterday, a listener got in touch to share their loved one's story. Ika Gribich was at the maternity clinic when the missile struck. She survived. Many of the people around her did not. She wrote down her experience and reflections after the attack. As Ika is still recovering, her words are read by one of our team. Here's her story.
Monday, 8th July 2024 has become a second birthday for me. I'm still alive. I was unfortunately caught up in the horrible missile strikes in Kyiv. I was sitting in a waiting room at a maternity clinic when the missile struck. I remember I was typing something into my phone and then the loudest bang. A noise so horrible, I can't describe it. I couldn't see anything. I was struggling to breathe. Eventually, I saw a light in the direction of my doctor's room. I walked towards it. His room was relatively undamaged. My doctor was alive, thank God. He managed to open a window. It helped me to breathe easier. It was impossible to walk anywhere. I was conscious my shoes had been blown off my feet from the blast. I was scared to walk. Glass and mangled shrapnel was everywhere. I saw my reflection in a mirror in my doctor's room. Blood was coming out of my ear. I couldn't hear out of this ear. I thought nothing of it. I was too shocked to understand anything. Slowly sleepwalking through a horror. Only later did I understand it could be serious. When doctors started to worry about internal bleeding. Thank goodness it would turn out to be a false alarm. Others sitting near me when the missile struck were not so lucky. Rescue teams began to clear a path for us to get out of the building. I walked this path with a patient and a medical intern who gave me his shaking hand. As we walked, we saw horrible things. Dead bodies. A doctor I recognised was missing a leg. I had been crying uncontrollably up to this point. And now my emotions overcame me. And the reality poured out of me in tears. When I got out of the building, ordinary people took over and offered me comfort and reassurance. One nearby office worker took me to a bomb shelter and helped me calm down. Gave me something to drink. Became a compass I could really rely on. I felt very strongly the overwhelming goodness from ordinary people, jumping into devastation to help, unquestioning. I understood then how strong Ukraine is. It gave me hope. I used her phone to call my husband. My phone was lost, like so much else. After I spoke to my husband, she took me to an ambulance. I was then attended to inside the ambulance. They started to disinfect all the shrapnel wounds on my body and gave me a very powerful injection. Soon, another lady was brought into the ambulance. She was in a very bad way. She held on to life by a thread. I would later understand she was a doctor and a mother of 3. She would pass away that day. My husband and I have understood that an angel wrapped its wings around me and protected me on Monday. I have been given a second chance to live. It's hard to make sense of anything at the moment beyond this, because everything is still so raw. I wanted to write this post because I can't understand why evil like this can be allowed to thrive and be visited upon a peaceful, beautiful city like Kyiv. There are so many powerful and creative nations on this earth that abhor what happened to Kyiv on Monday. It represents everything they stand against. They have the combined means and power to stop it happening again, and in the process reaffirm a future for all peaceful cities in the world. A future of hope and belief, not just for Kyiv, but for all cities in the world that want to thrive and live in peace. Hundreds of them, thousands of them. If only we had the unity of strength around the world to believe in this, to see it, to touch it, to make it a reality. Moscow can be shown that a world of hate cannot win, that hate won't be tolerated. But as of today, the combined will of the world is weaker than Moscow's. What does that mean for all of our futures? I keep thinking of the doctor in the ambulance with me. Mother of three. A creator, a builder, a giver. She brought 3 children into this world and countless more with her patience. She added to this world. And now she's gone. Yesterday I saw footage from a dashcam of a car that was driving by the hospital when the missile struck. At first, everyone assumed it was shrapnel from an intercepted missile. But to me, it looks like it was a direct, targeted missile strike, just like Ahmad did to Children's Hospital earlier on in the day. What kind of person presses a button to target a maternity clinic and a children's hospital? Targets a mother of 3 that's given so much to Kyiv and the world. When I ask this question, I am very relieved that I don't feel any hate. I am very relieved that I don't feel any hate to Russians and to Moscow. I'm so happy that love remains strong in my heart, overwhelms hate with its gentle power. I will never give in to hate. Instead, I will always remember the doctor in that ambulance with me. She gives me strength, what she stood for. I want to put my energy into her. Not the person that sent that missile to us. It is my decision alone to be filled with love or hate, and I choose love. And Moscow can't bomb my decision, because my decision is so much more powerful than Moscow's can ever be. Moscow can't bomb the example of the doctor. That is why love will always triumph over hate. Only if we stand together, all peaceful cities in the world, can we begin to fight back against the sickness that destroys us all. Kyiv stands and Kyiv survives. But we can't do it alone.
Thank you, Ika, for sharing your story with us. Now we go to our guest on today's podcast, who's been working on Monday's deadly missile strikes on Kyiv. Jake Godin, a senior researcher at Bellingcat. Jake, we brought you on because you were involved in the identification of the Russian missile attack on the Children's Hospital in Kyiv. Would you like to start just by introducing yourself and telling us a bit about your work?
Yeah, thanks, David. I'm Jake Godin with Bellingcat. I used to be at Scripps News, which is a US-based news outlet. I did a lot of open source work there. I've recently moved over to Bellingcat, and now I'm a researcher at Bellingcat, which is quite nifty, having worked with them already at Scripps News. And yeah, so with this kind of process with this KH-101 missile strike in Kyiv, it kind of started out because we wanted to simply debunk a lot of the rampant misinfo that was coming out around the strike. There was a lot of video footage that pretty clearly showed us something, hitting in Kyiv. And there was a lot of claims coming out saying, oh, it was a Ukrainian anti-air missile that fell into Kyiv and, that's what hit the hospital. Or it was an anti-air missile that hit a, Russian cruise missile and caused it to fall into this hospital. And so we kind of started out with that premise of saying, okay, let's take a look at some of these claims, some of these more out there claims too, and see what we can really debunk or what we can prove, whether or not, this is even a good place for somebody to start thinking. And that kind of led us down 2 paths. One of our researchers, Michael Sheldon, he tried to create models of the missile in order to compare it with what we saw in a video, which not a lot of times you get a really nice, clear shot of what's happening. But in this case, we did have a video make the rounds on Telegram that showed a missile in a pretty good profile coming in and hitting the hospital. And so his idea was to create this 3D model so that we could compare and say like, oh, is this closer to looking like a KH-101, which has a distinctive like turbojet engine hanging off the rear? Or is it this, is it closer to looking more like an anti-air missile? I took the approach of trying to see what we could do with the remnant analysis. And I think especially after a strike like this or an incident, which they're happening, daily in Ukraine, looking at the remnants is a good way of seeing what the munition was. And then that can tell you who was responsible. Ukraine, the government, through the prosecutor's office or through the emergency services or through the police, or in this case, the SBU, they have a process where they generally release remnants, images of remnants, so that in this investigation process on their end, so that they can collect evidence for, this was a Russian missile. We know because we have these, scraps, these pieces from it. And sometimes they have larger intact remnants that are from shot down missiles. And in this case, they the missile wasn't shot down. They had just like smaller pieces. And I had a list of previous incidents where KH-101 was supposedly used. And so I wasn't really getting that far comparing what was shared after the hospital strike with what I had seen previously. Then eventually we came up with an identification manual that the Ukrainian military uses, I guess, for determining what remnants to look out for specific missiles, one of them being the KH-101, which as somebody who has looked into remnants for previous incidents, this was a very useful manual, like a PDF to come across. And it was just a basic Google search, really, that I found it through. But in general, that has very specific parts of the missile labeled, and with most of them had images available. And so using that, we were able to compare one of the remnants that the SBU shared and find out that, oh, this is actually a wing strut. It has the unique shape and it has unique bolt holes in it. And so that we could actually say, oh, that matches up. And same thing for one of the engine panels, which also had writing on it. And that was actually where another useful reference image came into play, which is another researcher at Bellingcat, Carlos, found an engine panel that was being advertised on a aviation souvenir shop. They essentially were selling fins from the engine of KH-101s that were shot down in Ukraine as keychains. And they were in the image gallery for these keychains. They showed an engine panel from a KH-101, and it had the same exact handwritten identification numbers. Not that the numbers weren't the same, but it was in the same format. And so that just adds on this is an example of something from a KH-101.
That's absolutely fascinating, Jake. Several questions from me, and I think Roland and Dom might have some as well. But when you talk about remnants, you mean the bits of the missile which are left over, which have either been shot off or fallen off or end up on the ground surrounding the strike. Could you just talk us through what kind of things from the missile tend to survive? What are you actually looking at when you're looking at these remnants? What are they exactly?
Yeah, there's pieces that end up still in good shape. I don't have any EOD experience personally, so I think somebody with the explosive ordnance disposal experience might know better than myself. But as an outsider viewing remnants from various incidents throughout Ukraine and Syria and Gaza, all over, I think there are certain parts that tend to survive. Generally, I think they're more heavier pieces or more thicker metal pieces. I know in the case of caliber cruise missiles that are used in Ukraine quite often, the butt end of the missile tends to survive. It's a very heavy metal, where the thruster is or where the engine is at the end of the missile. I've recognized those whenever I see them. In the case of the KH-101s, I feel like the engine survives a lot of the times. Whether or not it has its cowling on or the engine cover on is another matter. But in general, it's a pretty concentrated piece of metal that I think is being on the end of the missile, so it tends to survive in one form or another. And so you start to see, oh, those are a bunch of fins that are part of that turbo engine that sits on the back of the missile. And then when there's also a difference between whether the missile was shot down and the warhead exploded or not. And so with a lot of KH-101s, in the imagery that I've seen from state emergency services, you'll see them with the warhead, and it's a very distinctive shape. That kind of provides us evidence in this incident, even though we see scraps of metal on the side of the road that they're kind of digging through, we can see that this warhead is still intact. And so we kind of have a better idea of what kind of missile was used there. And in some cases, there have been a lack of a warhead. And I think that those are, I don't have a ton of experience looking into it, but those were cases where they were empty decoy missiles, essentially, that didn't have an actual armed warhead inside of them.
Jake, just to bring some of this together then, to summarise, what are the characteristics and the clues, the evidence that suggests to you that this was a KH-101 Russian missile? What are the top things that you would point to people interested?
Well, I would say the remnants match up. We even went a little bit extra further, an extra mile, and we made sure to geolocate, these remnants were photographed at the scene where this took place. So it wasn't just somebody took some remnants from, a side shot and presented them in front of here. I mean, there were photos, there's visuals that show, different remnants from this KH-101 were present at the scene of the strike. And so I think that's one of the main things. I think the 3D modeling also really helps because you just have to do a side-by-side comparison and you can see that turbojet engine kind of hanging off the end. And so that gives you a better idea of what we're looking at. I think the remnants for me are what really sells it because you have some pretty direct comparisons to make with remnants seen in other incidents, or in this case with the identification manual. And I think, there could be other missiles that have a turbojet engine on the end. I don't think there are, or I don't think they're quite the same setup as the KH-101. So, it's really helpful to have that 3D model too. So, it was not an anti-air interceptor like an AIM-120 or something. It was, in this case, it was a KH-101.
Jake, hi, it's Dom here. Thanks so much for joining us today. Big fan of your work and the wider Bellingcat work. Often cite you on the pod here, all with full accreditation, of course. I've got a question about the trade more broadly, if I may. Been an explosion of open source data in recent years, leading to a whole number of OSINT, open source intelligence analysts. What would be your advice for anyone wanting to get into this area, to start learning how to be an open source intelligence researcher? Without giving too much of your biographical detail away, if you don't wish, but what sort of route did you take into this sphere?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think, I would like to just a little shout out to the Bellingcat's Discord community. I think is a really important space for open source work. There's a lot of various channels covering various parts of the world, and there's a Ukraine channel, and actually some of this investigation started on that Ukraine channel. There was a channel that, a sub channel created, and it was essentially let's take a look at this hospital bombing in Kyiv. And so I think joining that and kind of getting an eye out for this is kind of how people are going about this. This is the process that people are doing when they're trying to look into something, because it's not just Bellingcat folks on there, it's the community. And so when it comes to doing open source work, I think an important thing is to be able to find multiple sources, find multiple links, kind of whether it's on Telegram or Twitter or Facebook, or, it's being shared somewhere, visuals that kind of highlight an event, highlight something that's happening. And so it's both finding the visuals of maybe an incident that took place, and then finding reference imagery so that you can perhaps geolocate it or make sure that it happened where people are saying it happened. And I think that's a process that works really well with a large, when you get a lot of people kind of sifting through different places. And so that really helps out. I think if you're trying to get in open source stuff, it's really helpful to also just kind of practice. I mean, I do a lot of geolocation practice just for fun. And I was doing that before I started at Bellingcat. And I think in terms of getting into it myself, that's what I did at Scripps News. I just tried to geolocate things to verify it. I did a lot of White Helmets coverage in Syria, where I was going through their footage and trying to figure out, okay, well, these guys are in Idlib. They say there was a chemical weapons attack in Sarakib. Let's make sure that, let's geolocate this to make sure it's where it's at and find any other reference imagery. So it's not going to happen overnight, but, and you don't necessarily need a niche, but it's nice to find something that you can kind of get used to looking at, whether that's looking through Russian Telegram channels and Ukrainian Telegram channels to find evidence, to find certain incidents and find as much footage or photos as you can, so you can try to figure out what happened and build a better picture of what happened. Or if you're just looking through munitions constantly. I had a thread here on Twitter X where I was just trying to share every image that I came across of a certain type of submunition from Russian Grad missiles that they were using, cluster munitions that they were using in Ukraine, because I thought these are submunitions from a guided rocket, so they're being used in these civilian areas, so that means they're being pointed at these civilian areas and being used. So I just thought it was worth documenting every time we saw these submunitions in different places.
Thanks, Jake. And just finally for me, how can folk inside Ukraine help Bellingcat now? What would you suggest they do? You mentioned that site just there, but how else can people help?
Well, in Ukraine, ideally people need to be safe, I guess is the important thing. But in terms of, in an incident like this, because you don't want people going into the front line or anything, but documenting incidents is good. I know there's some concern in Ukraine about, especially like if there's anti-air missiles being fired off, you don't want to like post footage of that so that you're showing, the positioning of these. So I know that there's some concern about that. So it's like, that's kind of up to their own discretion. But I mean, I think visuals are really important. And if there's like visuals being shared in places that maybe researchers don't know about, I mean, getting it out in front of more people is helpful in terms of, I think a video that clearly shows a KH-101 being fired into a city is going to be more useful shared on Telegram and on X with, where more eyeballs can see it than like in a private WhatsApp group. But of course, there's always like concerns with like, whoever took that video, they may not want to share it so that, that maybe you don't want their position to be geolocated. You don't want their home to be geolocated, which is something that I think Bellingcat takes into account. And, we don't necessarily geolocate the exact location where things are filmed from, but kind of the general area in order to kind of protect some of their privacy. But I think it's important just to make sure that, visuals are well circulated so that we know kind of what happened, and verified, of course, too. But, that verification can be done down the line with geolocation and with reverse image search and what have you.
Let's move to our final thoughts then. Dom Nicholls, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks, David. I note in the last few minutes, Jennifer Jacobs, senior White House reporter for Bloomberg, she's put on Twitter that Donald Trump and Viktor Orban are due to meet today in Mar-a-Lago. She says this is likely to fan concerns that Orban is working as an intermediary between Putin and Trump. She cites her sources as saying that Trump has not asked Viktor Orban to lay the groundwork for any Ukrainian-Russian peace deal, but in my words now, this will undoubtedly add fuel to the fire as to quite what old Victor's up to on his summer tour. So keep an eye out for that later, everybody. And Tony, be very interested in your view maybe tomorrow if Orban does actually turn up in Mar-a-Lago. But yeah, that's from Jennifer Jacobs from Bloomberg.
Thank you very much, Tom. Let's go to Roland next, please.
So in terms of what Tony was saying about the outcome of the NATO summit, if I recall, it's a very strong kind of we will never accept Russia's illegal annexations in Ukraine and so on, and quite a clear message. From my conversations with people in Kyiv over the past couple of days, that's about as much as the Ukrainians were expecting from this, and I think they'll be pretty pleased with it, because the fear that was communicated to me from Kyiv was, look, we know that, an invitation to join is off the table. We're not getting that. We wanted to, but it's clearly not happening. What the thing that has to happen at this summit is for it not to go wrong. And what would go wrong would be if the message is fudged. If you introduce some kind of ambiguity into that kind of messaging that reassures Russia, that tells Russia that, yes, we've achieved deterrence here. We've got them on the run. Now, you might be able to say that, well, the very fact that America and Germany and Turkey and Hungary and maybe a few others have made it impossible for NATO to extend a formal invitation at this point to join NATO, you could say that means Russia has succeeded. On the other hand, the one thing that's remaining is the rhetoric, the sign of unity. I think that's what they were looking for, and I think they'll be hoping by the time this meeting breaks up, there won't be that much kind of grey space for Russia to exploit. But as Dom said, Viktor Orban's freelancing is definitely raising some eyebrows. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this Bloomberg story about the Ukrainians seeking another peace conference later on in the year and really keeping an eye on November. Is there going to be a big push from all sides to try and get peace on their terms before November? Watch this space.
Thank you, Dom and Roland. Tony Diver.
Well, I think this has been a really interesting discussion. I think what strikes me is that this summit is less about what's actually happening in the room and more about what's happening outside. And what we've seen in terms of diplomatic interventions is relatively incremental, I would argue. We're seeing NATO on the same trajectory that it was last year at Vilnius and the year before in Madrid. But behind the scenes, there's all of this nervousness about what's going on with Orban, with Trump, and with Biden himself. And actually, up until now, we'd seen NATO on a relatively steady trajectory, and there is just huge nervousness in the margins about what comes next and whether or not there is a major shift in the alliance's priorities under new leadership in the US, but also more generally. So I think we'll perhaps come out of this with a communique on paper which looks like something we perhaps would have expected, but we'll also have world leaders heading back to their capitals feeling a bit nervous about what happens in a year's time. And by that point, the alliance could be in very different territory.
Well, thank you very much, Roland, Tony and Dom. Jake, as our guest, would you like the very final thoughts?
Yeah, of course. I just, going back to civilian harm in Ukraine, I just want to highlight that Bellingcat has a website that tracks this. It's just ukraine.bellingcat.com. And there are other groups as well tracking open source related visuals that have to do with Ukraine. Center for Information Resilience is a good example. They have a Eyes on Russia map that tracks many, many incidents throughout Ukraine. And if somebody's more interested in looking at remnants, I would also have to give a shout out to Conflict Armament Research, CAR. They do really good field dispatches highlighting various unique weapon systems that are found in Ukraine. Like they recently looked at the North Korean missiles that were being used by Russia. So always good to be informed on these things. So just and keep up with it.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear.